He slammed the divorce papers onto our imported granite island, a sickening smirk twisting his face as he claimed half my family's fortune. He thought he'd completely outsmarted the Applewood legacy. He didn't know the judge was about to hand him a ruling that would permanently destroy his life. It was a Tuesday evening in late November, the kind of bitterly cold night where the wind howls against the floor-to-ceiling windows of our penthouse in Manhattan. I had spent the afternoon curating a private dinner for our 5th wedding anniversary. I remember the exact smell of the kitchen rosemary, garlic, and the rich, earthy scent of a Barolo breathing in its decanter. I was wearing the emerald silk dress Bradley had bought me in Milan, holding a pair of crystal wine glasses, genuinely believing I was living the perfect life. Then, the front door clicked open, and Bradley walked in. He didn't take off his cashmere coat. He didn't greet the golden retriever we'd raised from a puppy. He just walked straight into the kitchen, his polished Oxford shoes echoing aggressively against the hardwood floor. Before I could even say happy anniversary, he reached into his leather briefcase, pulled out a thick manila envelope, and tossed it onto the kitchen island. It landed right next to the charcuterie board, knocking over a small dish of olives. "I'm leaving you, Chloe," he said. His voice was entirely devoid of emotion, as casual as if he were ordering a coffee. "And I'm taking my half." I stared at the envelope, then at him. The crystal glasses in my hands suddenly felt as heavy as lead. "Bradley, what is this? What are you talking about?" "It's exactly what it looks like," he replied, leaning against the counter and crossing his arms. A slow, chilling smirk began to form on his lips. "I filed for divorce this morning. My lawyer will be in touch with yours, assuming you have the sense to hire one who can actually do math. But I'll save you the suspense. I want 50% of the Applewood estate." My heart plummeted into my stomach. The Applewood estate wasn't just money, it was generations of my family's hard work. A real estate empire built from the ground up by my grandfather and expanded by my father, Richard Applewood. When Bradley and I got married, my father had begged me to get a prenuptial agreement. He had seen something in Bradley's eyes, a hungry, calculated gleam that I, blinded by love, had completely ignored. I had fought my father on it, arguing that asking for a prenup would ruin the trust in our relationship. I had fought tooth and nail to protect Bradley's pride. Now, Bradley was looking at me like I was a stranger he had just successfully conned. "You're joking," I whispered, the reality of the betrayal constricting my throat. "Bradley, it's our anniversary. What is going on? Is there someone else?" He let out a sharp, genuine bark of laughter. It was a cruel, echoing sound that I will never forget for as long as I live. It was the laugh of a predator who had finally cornered its prey. "God, you've always been so painfully naive, Chloe," he sneered, shaking his head. "Did you really think I wanted to spend the rest of my life playing the loyal lapdog to the great Richard Applewood's daughter, attending those suffocating charity galas, pretending to care about your endless family traditions? I stayed for the payout. And since you were too utterly stupid to make me sign a prenup, New York law says I get half of everything acquired during our marriage. That includes the appreciation of your trust, the joint accounts, and the Hamptons house." I felt the blood drain from my face. My hands began to shake so violently I had to set the glasses down before I shattered them. "Who is she?" I asked, my voice barely a rasp. He pulled out his phone, tapped the screen, and turned it toward me. It was a photo of him on a yacht, the yacht my father had let us use last summer, with his arm wrapped tightly around a stunning blonde woman. I recognized her instantly. It was Jessica Foley, my friend, the luxury real estate agent who had helped us find this very penthouse, the woman who had drank champagne in my living room, complaining about how hard it was to find a good man. "Jessica and I have been together for 3 years, Bradley said, pocketing the phone with a sickeningly proud grin. "She actually respects me. She doesn't treat me like an employee of the Applewood empire." 3 years? I choked out, stumbling back against the oven. 3 years meant he had started sleeping with her just after my mother passed away. While I was grieving, crying myself to sleep, he was in the arms of my real estate agent. "Save the tears, Chloe," he said, turning toward the door. "I'm heading to the Four Seasons. Jessica is waiting. Have your lawyer call Greg Mitchell tomorrow. And don't try to hide any assets. I know exactly what you're worth." He walked out, slamming the heavy mahogany door behind him. The silence that followed was deafening. I stood in the kitchen for a full hour, the smell of the expensive dinner turning my stomach, the untouched wine mocking me. I didn't cry. The shock was too absolute, too paralyzing. I walked over to the manila envelope, peeled it open, and read the petition. He was demanding spousal support, 50% of all liquid assets, forced sale of our properties, and a lump sum payout from the Applewood family trust. He had timed it perfectly, waiting just long enough for a massive commercial real estate deal my father and I had closed to finalize, artificially inflating our joint marital assets. He laughed in my face. He called me stupid. He thought I was just a spoiled, naive daughter who would crumble under the pressure and write him a check to make the scandal go away. But Bradley forgot one crucial detail. I wasn't just a naive wife. I was Richard Applewood's daughter. And when an Applewood is backed into a corner, we don't cry. We go to war. The next morning, at 6 a.m., I drove my Audi straight to my father's estate in Westchester. The rain hadn't stopped, mirroring the heavy, suffocating weight in my chest. When the wrought iron gates swung open, I felt a tiny fraction of safety return. My father was in his oak-paneled study, drinking black coffee and reading the Wall Street Journal, looking every bit the intimidating titan of industry he was. When he saw my face, pale and exhausted from a sleepless night, he set the paper down immediately. "What did he do?" my father asked. His voice was low, gravelly, and instantly dangerous. I dropped the divorce petition onto his massive mahogany desk. He filed. He wants half. And he's been sleeping with Jessica Foley for 3 years. I waited for the "I told you so." I braced myself for the lecture about the prenup, about how I had been foolish to trust a man whose only ambition seemed to be spending our money. But Richard Applewood didn't gloat. He didn't yell. Instead, he stood up, walked around the desk, and pulled me into a fierce hug. I finally broke down, sobbing into his shoulder as he stroked my hair. "We are going to ruin him, Chloe," my father whispered, his tone terrifyingly calm. "He thinks he's playing a game of checkers. We are going to show him what chess looks like." By noon, the study had been transformed into a war room. My father had summoned our lead corporate attorney, David Rosenthal, a man notorious in Manhattan for being utterly ruthless in litigation. Beside him was Rachel Ford, the most meticulous forensic accountant on the East Coast. "Bradley thinks he has a standard community property or equitable distribution case," David explained, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses as he looked over the petition. "He's banking on the fact that without a prenup, the courts will look favorably on a 50-over-50 split of the marital assets. He wants $40 million, minimum. He doesn't get a dime," my father growled. Rachel Ford looked up from her laptop, tapping a silver pen against her chin. "If we want to destroy his claim, we need to prove he committed gross marital waste, breach of fiduciary duty, or fraud." "Chloe, did Bradley have access to the secondary accounts?" "Yes," I said, wiping my eyes and forcing myself to focus. "We had a joint operating account for household expenses, and he had signature authority on the Applewood LLC accounts for the properties he was managing for the firm." Rachel's fingers flew across the keyboard. "I'm going to need every ledger, every routing number, every receipt for the last 5 years. If he's been seeing this Jessica woman for 3 years, men like him don't fund that lifestyle from their own meager salaries. He's been using your money." For the next 3 weeks, we lived in that war room. I barely ate. I barely slept. The heartbreak had metamorphosed into a cold, hardened fury. Rachel traced wire transfers that Bradley had disguised as contractor fees for our properties. We found out that the luxury condo Jessica Foley lived in, which I thought she was just staging for sale, was actually leased under a shell company. A shell company funded entirely by Applewood LLC money. Bradley had embezzled over $4.2 million of my family's money to fund a secret life with his mistress. But that wasn't the twist. The real twist was something my father and David had engineered on the day of my wedding, a failsafe I hadn't even fully understood at the time. 2 months after he filed, we had our first mandatory settlement conference. We met in a sterile, glass-walled conference room at the courthouse in downtown Manhattan. I walked in wearing a tailored navy suit, my spine straight, channeling every ounce of my father's stoicism. Bradley was already there, flanked by his lawyer, Greg Mitchell. Bradley was wearing a custom Tom Ford suit, lounging in his chair with an air of unbearable arrogance. On his wrist was the $50,000 Patek Philippe watch I had bought him for his 30th birthday. When I sat down, he actually had the audacity to wink at me. "Let's cut to the chase," Greg Mitchell began, tossing a term sheet across the table. "My client is entitled to 50% of the marital estate. We estimate that at roughly $85 million. However, to save everyone the public embarrassment of a trial, Bradley is willing to walk away today for a lump sum of $35 million, the Hamptons house, and a non-disclosure agreement." David Rosenthal didn't even look at the paper. He just smiled a thin, shark-like smile. "Your client is entitled to absolutely nothing," David said softly. Bradley scoffed, leaning forward. "Come on, David. I know the law. Chloe was too stupid to get a prenup. I was a legal spouse. The assets grew during the marriage. Pay up, or I'll take this to trial and drag the Applewood name through the mud." "Oh, we welcome a trial, Bradley," David replied, pulling out a single sheet of paper from his briefcase. "But before we proceed, perhaps you should review the actual structure of the Applewood Family Trust. Specifically, the employment clause you signed on your wedding day." Bradley frowned, exchanging a confused look with his lawyer. "What employment clause?" "You didn't marry into the money, Bradley," I spoke up, my voice steady and icy. "You signed a W-2. Bradley's arrogant smirk faltered for the first time. "What the hell are you talking about, Chloe?" "When my father hired you to manage the downtown properties on the day we got married," I said, leaning across the table and locking eyes with the man who had broken my heart, "you signed a standard executive contract. You were so eager to get your hands on a six-figure salary and an expense account that you didn't read the fine print. You signed an employee morality clause, an arbitration agreement, and a full waiver of marital asset claim against the trust." Greg Mitchell snatched the paper from David's hands, his eyes darting frantically across the page. I watched the color literally drain from the lawyer's face. This is an ironclad corporate firewall," Mitchell stammered, looking at Bradley with sheer panic. "You didn't tell me you signed an employee waiver against the trust." "I didn't know," Bradley shouted, his facade cracking. He turned his glare onto me. "You set me up. This won't hold up in court. The judge will see right through this trick." "The judge," David interrupted, his tone laced with venom, "will be very interested to see the forensic accounting report we've prepared, detailing the $4.2 million you embezzled from your employer Applewood LLC to fund an illicit affair. Embezzlement is a felony, Bradley. You aren't walking away with a divorce settlement. You're looking at 10 to 15 years in federal prison." The silence in the room was absolute. Bradley stared at me, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. The confident, laughing man who had thrown divorce papers in my face was gone, replaced by a terrified little boy realizing he had just stepped onto a landmine. But I wasn't done. The real destruction was yet to come in front of the judge, where Bradley's entire world was going to be publicly and systematically dismantled. And I was going to enjoy every single second of it. Despite the absolute bloodbath of the settlement conference, Bradley's arrogance proved to be a terminal disease. Instead of taking the out, we practically handed him walking away with nothing but avoiding immediate criminal charges. His bruised ego took the wheel. He fired Greg Mitchell that very afternoon, claiming the lawyer was a coward who had been intimidated by my father's wealth. He then hired a flashy, aggressively loud litigator named Victor Thorne-Waite, Victor Gallagher, who promised Bradley he could pierce the corporate veil and invalidate the employment contract. Bradley was convinced the embezzlement charges were just a scare tactic. He honestly believed my father and I wouldn't risk the public spectacle of a criminal trial. He thought the Applewood reputation was too fragile to endure a scandal. He was wrong. We didn't care about the tabloids. We cared about exterminating a parasite. The trial began in mid-February, presided over by the Honorable Judge Caroline Wentworth, a notoriously uncompromising woman who had zero tolerance for frivolous litigation or courtroom theatrics. The courtroom in downtown Manhattan was a theater of polished oak, high ceilings, and freezing air conditioning that made my skin prickle under my charcoal gray Chanel suit. My father sat in the gallery right behind me, an immovable mountain of support, flanked by William Thatcher, our chief operating officer. Victor Gallagher opened the proceedings with a theatrical speech, painting Bradley as the devoted, dutiful husband who had been financially oppressed and tricked into signing a fraudulent W-2 by a manipulative, billionaire family. He demanded the $40 million, framing it as rightful compensation for years of unpaid marital labor. Then, it was David Rosenthal's turn. David didn't yell. He didn't pace. He calmly walked to the podium, adjusted his glasses, and methodically began to dismantle Bradley's life brick by brick. "Your Honor," David began, his voice echoing cleanly through the silent room, "the plaintiff is not a victim of financial oppression. He is a corporate employee who breached his fiduciary duty, violated a morality clause, and committed grand larceny against Applewood LLC. For 2 days, we presented our evidence. Rachel Ford, our forensic accountant, took the stand and projected Bradley's hidden financials onto a large monitor. She walked the judge through the labyrinth of shell companies Bradley had created. The most damning was a corporate entity named Horizon Ventures LLC. Bradley had routed over $4.2 million from our joint operating accounts and the Applewood commercial property funds into Horizon Ventures, categorizing them as HVAC repairs, structural renovations, and consulting fees. "And where did these funds ultimately go, Miss Ford?" David asked. "They were transferred directly to a residential escrow account," Rachel answered, adjusting her microphone. "Specifically, they were used to purchase a $3.8 million luxury penthouse on the Upper East Side, deeded entirely in the name of Jessica Foley, with the remaining $400,000 used to furnish the apartment and lease a 2024 Porsche 911. I watched Bradley from the corner of my eye. He was sweating. The customized Tom Ford suits he wore couldn't hide the way his hands shook as Rachel read out the wire transfer dates that perfectly coincided with days I had been out of town, visiting my sick aunt, or days he claimed he was working late to close a deal for my father. But the absolute peak of the trial, the moment that shifted the air pressure in the room, came on the 3rd day, when David called Jessica Foley to the stand as a hostile witness. Jessica walked in looking like a deer caught in the headlights. She wore a modest beige dress, severely underdressed compared to the designer labels she usually flaunted. She had been subpoenaed, and her own attorney had advised her to tell the truth to avoid being charged as an accessory to fraud. When she sat in the witness box, Bradley actually smiled at her, a desperate, pleading look, as if expecting her to defend their grand romance. "Miss Foley," David said, pacing slowly in front of the jury box. "You are the sole owner of the penthouse located on East 72nd Street, correct?" "Yes," Jessica whispered. "And did you purchase this property with your own funds from your commissions as a real estate agent?" "No," she replied, her eyes darting nervously toward Judge Wentworth. "Bradley purchased it for me." "I see," David mused. "And were you aware that Bradley was using embezzled corporate funds to buy this property?" "No, absolutely not," Jessica answered quickly, her voice rising in pitch. "He told me it was his money. He said his investments had paid off, and he wanted to provide a home for us." David paused, letting her lie hang in the air. Then, he walked to his table and picked up a thick stack of bank statements. "Miss Foley, are you familiar with a man named Ian Foley?" David asked. Jessica's face instantly lost all its color. Her jaw dropped slightly. He is my brother." Bradley frowned, leaning forward in his chair. He had never met an Ian Foley. "Your brother," David nodded. "The same brother who resides in the Cayman Islands. The same brother whose offshore account received a series of wire transfers totaling $1.5 million from your personal accounts over the last 18 months? The courtroom erupted into a low murmur. Even Judge Wentworth leaned forward, her eyes narrowing behind her reading glasses. Bradley's jaw practically hit the defense table. "Objection. Relevance," Victor Gallagher shouted, standing up. "Overruled," Judge Wentworth snapped. "I want to hear this, counselor. Proceed, Mr. Rosenthal." "Miss Foley," David continued, his voice sharp as a scalpel, "our investigators found that immediately after Mr. Concho, Bradley deposited funds into your account for living expenses. You were siphoning 40% of that money into an offshore account controlled by your brother, an account entirely out of Bradley's reach. In fact, text messages recovered between you and your brother reveal that you referred to Bradley as, and I quote, an easy mark with a blank check. Is that correct?" I can explain," Jessica stammered, tears welling in her eyes as her carefully constructed facade crumbled. "You don't need to," David said coldly, "because you were never planning to marry him, were you? As soon as the divorce settlement cleared, you were going to sell the penthouse and moved to the Caymans with the stolen cash. You were conning the con man. Bradley stood up, his chair scraping violently against the wood floor. You bitch! He screamed at Jessica, his face purple with rage. I ruined my marriage for you. I stole for you. Order! Judge Wentworth slammed her gavel down with the force of a thunderclap. Bailiffs, restrain the plaintiff. One more outburst, Mr. Bradley, and I will hold you in criminal contempt. Bradley collapsed back into his chair, burying his face in his hands. He was completely broken. He had thrown away a lifetime of security, wealth, and a wife who had genuinely loved him, all for a woman who saw him as nothing more than a walking ATM. The smirk that had adorned his face the night he handed me those divorce papers was gone forever, replaced by the crushing weight of his own profound stupidity. Closing arguments took less than an hour. Victor Gallagher had virtually nothing to say. His client had just confessed to embezzlement in open court while screaming at his mistress. When Judge Caroline Wentworth returned to the bench to deliver her ruling, the silence in the room was suffocating. I sat perfectly still, my father's hand resting firmly on my shoulder. In my 20 years on the bench, Judge Wentworth began, her voice echoing with absolute authority. I have presided over hundreds of high-net-worth divorces. I have seen greed, I have seen betrayal, and I have seen staggering entitlement. But I have rarely witnessed a plaintiff as brazen, reckless, and morally bankrupt as you, Mr. Bradley. She looked down at him over her glasses, her expression one of utter disgust. You initiated this proceeding hoping to exploit the lack of a prenuptial agreement, completely ignoring the legally binding corporate contracts you signed. You betrayed your marital vows, breached your fiduciary duty to your employer, and engaged in a systematic campaign of financial fraud. She adjusted the papers on her desk. Therefore, I am ruling unequivocally in favor of the defense. The employment waiver is valid and binding. The plaintiff, Mr. Bradley, is entitled to 0% of the Applewood family trust, 0% of the marital properties, and 0 spousal support. Bradley let out a hollow, suffocating gasp. Furthermore, Judge Wentworth continued, raising her voice to cut through his shock. I am ordering the immediate liquidation of the 72nd Street penthouse, with all proceeds returning to Applewood LLC as restitution. Miss Foley, you will have 30 days to vacate the premises. Lastly, based on the evidence of grand larceny presented in this court, I am formally referring this case and all associated financial records to the Manhattan District Attorney's Office with a strong recommendation for criminal prosecution. We are adjourned. The gavel slammed down. It sounded like a gunshot. It sounded like freedom. I stood up, smoothing the front of my jacket. My father kissed my cheek, a rare smile breaking across his stern face, before he and David walked out into the hallway to handle the press. As I turned to leave, Bradley intercepted me near the gallery railing. He looked entirely hollowed out. His designer suit suddenly looked too big for him. His skin was a sickly gray. There was no arrogance left, no cruel laughter, just raw, unadulterated panic. Chloe, please, he begged, his voice cracking. He actually reached out to touch my arm, but I stepped back, looking at his hand as if it were coated in poison. Chloe, you can't let them send me to prison. I'll do anything. I'll pay it back. I'll work it off. I was manipulated. Jessica played me. You heard her. Please, we were married. You loved me once. I looked into the eyes of the man I had spent 5 years with. I searched for any lingering trace of the love I used to feel, any spark of sympathy. There was nothing. He had killed it all the night he laughed in my face. You're right, Bradley, I said, my voice barely a whisper, yet loud enough to echo in his nightmares. I did love you. And if you had just asked for a divorce, I probably would have given you enough money to live comfortably for the rest of your life. But you had to be greedy. You had to try and humiliate me. I leaned in slightly, breathing in the scent of his panicked sweat. Have your lawyer call the DA. And Bradley? I hear the jumpsuits in federal prison don't come in, Tom Ford. I turned on my heel and walked out of the courtroom, the heavy oak doors closing behind me with a satisfying, permanent thud. It's been 2 years since the trial. The Manhattan District Attorney didn't waste any time. Faced with an insurmountable mountain of forensic evidence, Bradley accepted a plea deal. He is currently serving a 7-year sentence in a minimum security federal correctional institution in Pennsylvania. He owes my family $4.2 million in restitution, a debt that will garnish whatever meager wages he earns for the rest of his natural life. Jessica Foley tried to flee to the Caymans, but her assets were frozen before she could board the plane. She was stripped of her real estate license and is currently facing civil litigation from 3 different former clients who discovered she had been skimming off their escrow accounts as well. As for me, I didn't just survive the storm, I learned how to control the lightning. I took over as CEO of Applewood LLC last spring, when my father officially retired. I sold the penthouse where Bradley broke my heart, moved into a beautiful townhouse in Brooklyn Heights, and expanded our company's portfolio by 20% in my first year. Sometimes, the universe doesn't just hand you karma. Sometimes, you have to hire a forensic accountant, put on a Chanel suit, and deliver the karma yourself. Thank you so much for reading my story. If this journey of betrayal, legal strategy, and ultimate revenge resonated with you, please hit that like button to show your support. Don't forget to share this video with anyone who loves a true story where the villain gets exactly what they deserve. Subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you never miss another dramatic real-life narrative. Stay strong, know your worth, and I'll see you in the next video.